On my birthday, my parents called me and said, "We have a surprise gift for you." Then they moved all my belongings out of the house. I stood on the sidewalk as the rain began to mist. My bed frame leaned against a dying oak tree. Cardboard boxes lined the curb like jagged teeth. I checked my phone for a follow-up text. Nothing appeared on the screen but a cracked reflection. The front door remained bolted shut. I realized then that my house key felt light and useless. The humid air smelled of wet asphalt and old paper. I approached the boxes to find my college diploma at the bottom of a trash bag. My father watched me from the upstairs window. He did not wave or offer an explanation. He simply pulled the heavy curtains closed. I saw a dark sedan idling across the street. It was Julian's car. He looked at his watch and adjusted his silk tie. My father was clearly expecting him to arrive exactly now. I stepped onto the porch and pounded the wood. My mother did not answer the bell. Instead, I heard the mechanical hum of the locks changing inside. It was a sharp and rhythmic sound. They were sealing the perimeter. I turned to see Julian stepping out of his vehicle. He carried a leather briefcase like a weapon. He did not look sorry for me at all. He looked like a man about to close a deal. My parents had finally traded me for debt. Julian walked toward me with a measured pace. He gestured at the boxes scattered on the lawn. He told me that my father made a significant mistake at the casino. Now the house belonged to a shell company. I looked at the legal papers he pulled from his coat. My name was signed at the bottom of every page. The ink looked fresh and perfect. My father had practiced my handwriting for months. I was now legally responsible for $1 million loss. The rain turned heavy and soaked my clothes. I reached into a box and found my old journals. The pages were damp and blurred. I realized my parents had been planning this since my graduation. They kept me close just to use my credit. Julian offered me a hand to help me up. His touch felt like a cold iron shackle. He whispered that he could make the debt vanish. I saw my mother peeking through the shutters. She was holding my childhood teddy bear. I pulled my arm away and stood tall. I did not cry or beg for entry. I grabbed my laptop and the forged documents. I walked toward the bus stop without looking back. Julian shouted that I had nowhere else to go. He was wrong. I knew a clerk at the courthouse who owed me a favor. I would file the police report before the sun went down. My parents thought they moved me out. They actually just let a wolf off its leash. The bus station was a fluorescent graveyard. I sat on a plastic bench with my laptop bag clutched tight. Water dripped from my hair onto the tile floor. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a photo of a shredder eating my birth certificate. Julian was fast. He was erasing the paper trail before I could reach the city center. I had to find a way to stop the digital bleed. The last bus was delayed by 30 minutes. I opened my laptop and tapped into the house Wi-Fi from the sidewalk. The signal was weak but steady. I bypassed the admin password using my father's favorite poker hand. The screen flickered to life. I saw a hidden folder titled Inheritance. Inside were hundreds of scanned documents from the last decade. My father hadn't just used my credit. He had signed over my future earnings to a private lender. A shadow fell over my keyboard. I looked up to see a tall man in a gray uniform. He was a private security guard. He told me the station was closing for maintenance. I checked the wall clock. It was only 9 o'clock. This was another one of Julian's moves. He was clearing the streets to keep me isolated. I stood up and backed away from the entrance. The guard didn't move. He just watched my every step. I ducked into an alleyway behind the station. The smell of wet trash and ozone filled my lungs. I reached into my pocket for my backup drive. My fingers brushed against a small metal key. It was a key to my grandmother's safety deposit box. My mother must have slipped it into my coat before the eviction. I realized she wasn't just crying at the window. She was giving me a weapon. Julian didn't know about the vault. My phone rang in the dark. It was my mother's voice. She whispered that the house was being swept for bugs. She told me to stay away from the bank. Julian had men stationed at every branch in the county. He was waiting for me to lead him to the physical evidence. I looked at the key in my palm. The brass was cold and tarnished. My mother hung up before I could ask for help. I heard footsteps crunching on the gravel behind me. 2 men in dark suits rounded the corner. They didn't look like guards. They looked like professional collectors. I didn't run. I stepped into the light of a street lamp. I opened my laptop and hit the broadcast button. I was streaming the contents of the Inheritance folder to every news outlet in the city. The men stopped in their tracks. They looked at their vibrating phones in unison. The stream was live for exactly 10 seconds before the connection died. It was enough. The collectors backed away into the shadows. I knew Julian would see the alert on his dashboard. He was probably screaming at his technical team right now. I turned the corner and saw a taxi idling at the curb. The driver rolled down the window and nodded. It was Marcus, my father's old bookie. He held up a thick manila envelope. I climbed into the back seat of the taxi. Marcus did not look at me through the mirror. He handed the manila envelope over the headrest with a grunt. The paper felt heavy and smelled of cheap tobacco. Inside were the original property deeds for the family estate. My father had not lost the house in a game of poker. He had sold it to Marcus 5 years ago. I was living in a stolen house all along. The car moved through the rain with a low growl. Marcus told me that Julian was just a collection agent. He was never the owner or the developer. He was the middleman hired to scare me into signing the new debt. I gripped the deeds until my knuckles turned white. My parents knew the house was gone years ago. They were just looking for a way to stay inside. They sacrificed my future for 5 more years of comfort. We passed the old town square where the clock was stuck. Marcus turned onto a dirt road near the industrial docks. He stopped the car in front of a rusted warehouse. He told me that Julian was waiting inside with my father. They were trying to finalize the second mortgage before the news leak hit. I looked at the dark building and felt a surge of cold fury. This was where the lies would finally stop for everyone. I stepped out of the taxi and onto the gravel. Marcus gave me a heavy flashlight and a warning. He said that Julian had more than just suits on his payroll. He had the local precinct in his pocket. I clicked the light on and saw a black SUV parked by the loading bay. The license plate was familiar. It belonged to the chief of police. My plan to file a report was dead before it started. I crept toward the side entrance of the warehouse. The air inside was thick with the scent of diesel. I heard voices echoing from a glass office on the mezzanine. My father was shouting about his loyalty. Julian was laughing at him with a cruel and sharp sound. I realized that Julian never intended to save the house for them. He was going to bulldoze the place for a luxury mall project. My parents were homeless too. I climbed the metal stairs with a silent prayer. I reached the landing and saw them through the window. Julian held a pen out to my father. He promised that the signatures would clear the gambling debts forever. My father grabbed the pen with trembling fingers. He did not see the eviction notice tucked under the contract. Julian was about to steal the last of the family cash. I threw the heavy deeds against the glass and screamed. The glass shattered into 1,000 jagged diamonds. Julian spun around with a look of pure shock. My father dropped the pen and stared at the deeds on the floor. He recognized the signature of his old bookie immediately. I stepped into the room with my laptop raised. I told him the broadcast was already reaching the district attorney. Julian smiled and pulled a small remote from his pocket. The warehouse doors began to slide shut with a roar. The heavy steel doors slammed shut with a thunderous boom. The sound echoed through the hollow warehouse like a funeral bell. Julian's smile stayed fixed as he pointed the remote at the mezzanine. He told my father that the plan had changed. There would be no more negotiations or second mortgages tonight. I gripped the railing as the lights overhead flickered and died. The only glow came from my laptop screen. Julian had disabled the local cellular tower signal. My father slumped into a chair and put his head in his hands. He looked old and defeated in the dim shadows. I realized he had been working for Julian as an informant for weeks. He was the one who told them about the safety deposit box. My own father had traded my secrets for a clean slate. I felt a cold knot of anger tighten in my chest. He was not a victim. He was an active partner. Julian stepped closer and demanded the deeds. He said the broadcast failed to reach the city servers in time. I looked at the upload bar on my screen. It was stuck at 99% due to the jammer. I needed to reach the roof to bypass the interference. There was a rusted ladder near the back of the office. Julian moved to block my path with a heavy step. He was faster than he looked in his suit. I swung the flashlight at the office window frame. The remaining shards of glass rained down on the carpet. Julian flinched and covered his eyes for a split second. I scrambled over the desk and reached for the ladder. My father did not try to stop me or help me. He just sat there staring at the floor. I began to climb as Julian shouted for the men below. The metal rungs were slippery with old engine oil. I reached the roof hatch and kicked it open. The wind howled and the rain lashed against my face. I could see the city skyline in the distance. The cellular tower was glowing red atop the hill. I held the laptop high and waited for the bar to move. The signal was still blocked by a local device. I realized Julian had the jammer in his pocket. He was standing right underneath me on the metal catwalk. I heard the catwalk groan under his weight. Julian was climbing the ladder with a calm and steady rhythm. He told me that the police chief was already on the way. They would find me with the stolen deeds and the broken glass. It would look like a burglary gone wrong. I backed away toward the edge of the gravel roof. There was no escape and no signal. Then I saw a drone hovering in the dark. The drone drifted closer and projected a blue light. I recognized the marking on the wing. It belonged to the district attorney's investigative unit. Julian looked up and his face turned a pale shade of gray. The broadcast had worked after all. It had triggered an automatic emergency response. I looked at the hatch and saw my mother's face. She was holding Julian's phone and the remote. She had finally chosen a side. Julian froze on the ladder as the drone's blue light washed over the roof. My mother climbed onto the gravel with a fierce look in her eyes. She held Julian's high-tech phone like a trophy. The screen showed the jammer interface had been deactivated. My mother had slipped the device from his pocket when they were arguing near the office. She finally realized that her silence was killing me. Julian reached for the phone, but the drone dropped lower. It began recording every move. The wind whipped my hair across my face as I looked at the upload bar. It hit 100% with a soft chime. The legal files were now in the hands of the federal investigators. Julian knew the game was over. He looked at the edge of the roof and then at the open hatch. He whispered that we were all going down together. I saw a red dot appear on his chest. A sniper from the tactical team was already in position. Suddenly, my father appeared behind my mother with a heavy iron pipe. He didn't look defeated anymore. He looked desperate and dangerous. He swung the pipe at the drone, missing by inches. He didn't want the evidence to reach the authorities because it proved his own crimes. I realized then that my father was more afraid of prison than he was of Julian. He shoved my mother toward the edge of the roof. She gasped and lost her footing on the wet gravel. I lunged forward and grabbed my mother's sleeve. The fabric strained as I pulled her back from the abyss. Julian used the chaos to scramble back down the ladder. He was heading for the side exit where the SUV was parked. My father stood over us with the pipe raised high. He told me to delete the backup files right now. I stared at him and saw a complete stranger. The man who raised me was gone. He was just a cornered animal now. I held the laptop over the edge of the roof. I told him the files were already mirrored on 3 different servers. Deleting the local copy would change nothing at all. My father hesitated as the sound of sirens grew louder. The police chief was not coming to save them. The sirens belonged to the state police. Julian's influence ended at the city limits. I saw the blue and red lights reflecting off the warehouse windows. My father dropped the heavy pipe and collapsed. My mother stood up and straightened her coat. She took the laptop from my hands and closed the lid. She told me that there was one more secret in the warehouse basement. Julian hadn't just been laundering money for my father. He was storing stolen historical artifacts from the city museum. This was why the house foreclosure was so urgent. They needed a secure location for the final transport. I looked at the hatch and felt a new chill. The vault was right beneath us. We heard a muffled explosion from deep inside the building. The floor beneath our feet vibrated with a low and heavy groan. Julian wasn't trying to escape anymore. He was trying to destroy the evidence by blowing up the foundations. Thick black smoke began to pour out of the ventilation shafts. The roof was becoming unstable as the steel supports buckled. I looked at the ladder, but it had twisted away from the wall. We were trapped on a collapsing roof with no way down. The roof shuddered as a second explosion ripped through the warehouse core. Heat radiated through the soles of my boots. My mother clutched my arm as the gravel shifted beneath us. We looked at the twisted ladder hanging uselessly over the edge. The descent was now impossible, without a miracle. Smoke billowed from the hatch like an angry ghost. I needed to find a structural anchor before the center collapsed. My father sat frozen near the ledge. He was watching the flames lick the steel beams below us. The tactical drone hovered closer as a spotlight cut through the dark smoke. A voice boomed from a speaker telling us to stay perfectly still. I looked at the crane arm parked near the loading bay. It was our only hope for a quick exit. I shouted at the drone to relay a message to the ground team. The roof groaned again as a support beam snapped. We were losing the battle against gravity. I saw Julian's silhouette sprinting toward the crane controls in the yard. Julian intended to use the crane to swing a heavy cargo container into the office. He wanted to finish the job and bury us in the rubble. I grabbed a flare from the emergency kit on my belt. I struck the cap and a brilliant crimson light erupted. I threw the flare toward the crane cabin to blind him. The red glare reflected off the falling rain. Julian flinched and the crane arm swung wildly to the left. It crashed into the brick chimney, instead of our platform. The impact of the crane arm sent a shockwave through the warehouse roof. My mother fell to her knees as the gravel cascaded away. I grabbed her hand and pulled her toward the sturdy corner column. My father finally moved toward the chimney stack. He realized the crane had created a makeshift bridge to the yard. He climbed onto the brickwork with a desperate speed. I saw him reach the metal arm of the crane. He was leaving us behind to save his own skin. I watched my father scramble along the lattice of the crane arm. He did not look back at his wife or daughter. He reached the mainmast and began his descent to the ground. Julian was struggling to regain control of the levers. The flare was still burning bright on the cabin roof. I looked at the gap between the roof and the chimney. It was a jump of 4 feet over a fiery pit. I told my mother to jump on the count of 3. The heat was becoming unbearable as the ventilation shafts began to melt. I shoved the laptop into my jacket and braced for the leap. My mother went first and landed hard on the brick ledge. I followed her and felt the roof vanish behind me. A massive fireball erupted from the basement vault. The air was sucked out of my lungs by the vacuum. We huddled on the chimney as the warehouse collapsed into a pile of twisted metal. Julian was trapped in the crane. State police cruisers swarmed the yard as the fire intensified. I saw officers dragging Julian from the crane cabin. He was screaming about the artifacts and the missing deeds. My father was nowhere to be seen in the chaos. I realized he had slipped away into the industrial park during the collapse. But the sirens in the distance suggested his flight would be short-lived. My mother looked at the burning ruins and sighed. She held the tarnished brass key up to the flashing blue lights. The tactical team reached the base of the chimney with a ladder. They helped us down as the fire department began their work. I felt the cold rain on my face and finally breathed. The forensic team was already scanning the yard for the missing deeds. I reached into my jacket to check the laptop. The screen was cracked, but the hard drive was spinning. My mother whispered that the key did not belong to a bank. It was for a private storage locker downtown. We sat in the back of an ambulance while paramedics checked our vitals. The blanket felt heavy and warm against my shivering skin. My mother told me the locker contained the physical proof of the museum thefts. Julian had forced my father to act as the getaway driver. This was the leverage Julian held over our family for years. I looked at the key and saw a small serial number. It matched the inventory tags on the museum's stolen collection list. We were not finished yet. A black car pulled up next to the ambulance and the windows rolled down. The district attorney looked at me with a grim expression. She said that my father had been apprehended at the shipyard. He was carrying a suitcase full of cash and a forged passport. She thanked me for the broadcast and the mirror files. However, she had one more piece of news that chilled me. The chief of police had escaped with the manila envelope. The deeds were gone again. The district attorney's words hung in the damp air like a death sentence. The police chief was gone with the only physical evidence of my home's ownership. I stood up and pushed the warm blanket off my shoulders. My mother clutched the brass key so hard her knuckles turned white. We had to move before the chief reached the city limits. I knew he had a private boat docked at the North Pier. It was his traditional escape route for sensitive business. We had to beat him to the water. Marcus pulled the taxi up to the ambulance with a sharp screech of tires. He looked at the district attorney and tipped his cap. He told us that the chief's car was spotted heading toward the bridge. We climbed in and Marcus pushed the engine to its limit. The streets were slick with oil and rain. I opened my laptop and tracked the chief's burner phone signal. I had planted a tracker on his bumper during the warehouse chaos. The red dot was moving toward the dark industrial docks. The docks were a maze of shipping containers and rusted cranes. Marcus turned off the headlights as we approached the marina entrance. I saw the chief's black cruiser parked near the end of the pier. The engine was still ticking as it cooled. I grabbed a heavy wrench from the floor of the taxi. My objective was simple. I had to reclaim the manila envelope before he burned it. The chief was standing on the deck of a white cabin cruiser. He was holding a silver lighter. I jumped out of the moving taxi and sprinted across the wooden planks. The chief looked up and his eyes widened with recognition. He flicked the lighter and the flame danced in the wind. He threatened to drop the deeds into the black water. I told him the digital files were already public. Burning the paper would only prove his guilt to the jury. He hesitated for a second. That was the opening I needed. I swung the wrench and hit the lighter out of his hand. The lighter hissed as it hit the cold river. The chief lunged at me with a roar of frustration. We tumbled onto the deck of the boat. I felt the manila envelope pressed between our bodies. He was strong and smelled of expensive bourbon. He tried to shove me over the railing. I grabbed a coil of rope and looped it around his ankle. The boat began to drift away from the pier. I realized the mooring lines were already cut. We were floating into the current. My mother appeared at the edge of the pier and threw a life ring. It hit the deck with a heavy thud. The chief scrambled for his service weapon in his holster. I realized the holster was empty. Marcus had pickpocketed the gun when the chief was distracted at the warehouse. The power had shifted completely. I held the envelope high and backed away. The chief collapsed against the steering wheel. He looked like a man who had lost his soul. He finally surrendered the fight. The district attorney arrived with 3 black sedans and a spotlight. They boarded the boat and handcuffed the chief in silence. I handed the manila envelope to the lead investigator. He checked the seal and nodded. The property deeds were safe and dry. My mother stepped onto the deck and hugged me tight. We had finally reclaimed our name and our future. I looked at the dark water and felt a sense of peace. The long night was finally over for us. Or so I thought. We drove back to the house as the sun began to rise. The "for sale" sign was gone from the front lawn. My mother used her master key to open the front door. The house was cold and empty. All my belongings were still in the boxes on the curb. I realized I didn't want to live here anymore. This place was full of ghosts and lies. I wanted to start over in a city where nobody knew my name. My mother agreed and started packing her bags. I walked into the kitchen to get a glass of water, hoping for a moment of quiet. Then I saw a small gift box sitting on the counter. It was wrapped in gold paper with a blue ribbon. There was no card or name on the package. I opened it and found a brand new house key. It was made of solid gold. At the bottom of the box was a note from Julian. It said that the warehouse was just a distraction. The real surprise was already in the basement. I heard a loud click below. The metallic echo of the basement lock signaled a final trap. I dropped the gold key and grabbed the kitchen counter. My mother turned pale as the floorboards began to vibrate. Julian had hidden a thermal detonator near the gas main. We had exactly 60 seconds to reach the front lawn. I grabbed her hand and ran toward the open door. The boxes on the curb were the only cover we had left. We dived behind the heavy oak dresser. A dull roar shook the foundation of the family estate. Smoke poured from the shattered windows like a thick shroud. The gold gift box vanished into a cloud of black soot. I looked at the ruins and realized the truth. Julian never wanted the house or the artifacts. He wanted to erase every trace of the family history. My parents were witnesses to his earliest crimes. The explosion was not a threat. It was a clean slate for him. The fire sirens wailed as the neighborhood woke up. My mother stared at the burning heap of wood and plaster. She reached into her pocket and pulled out the small brass key. The storage locker downtown was the only thing Julian missed. It held the original ledger and the recovered artifacts that would seal Julian's fate forever. I stood up and brushed the glass from my jacket. We were not victims of a surprise gift anymore. We were the owners of the only evidence remaining. Julian's accomplice appeared at the edge of the street in a new car, speaking through a speaker system with Julian's voice. He did not sound angry about the failed assassination. He sounded impressed by our survival against the blast. He rolled down the window and tipped his head. He told us that the ledger was just a copy. The real proof was buried in the foundation of my new apartment. He had bought my future before I even moved out. Every wall I owned was filled with his secrets. I realized then that my independence was just another illusion. My parents were not the only ones who betrayed me. The realtor and the bank were on his secret payroll. I looked at the gold key lying on the sidewalk. It was a tracker that led him straight to my front door. He knew my every move since the birthday call. I threw the gold key into the sewer grate and smiled. I had already switched the trackers at the pier, placing my beacon on the car while Marcus distracted the guards earlier that evening. The police cruiser surrounded Julian's car before he could drive away. The gold key in the sewer began to emit a loud signal. It triggered a remote lock on his own engine. I had won the game by using his own technology. My mother squeezed my hand as they led him away in cuffs. The sun finally rose over the empty lot. My birthday was over, but my life was finally mine. I walked away from the ashes.